You have tried this before, a new plan, a new app, a new set of rules written down with real hope behind them. And for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, it worked. You felt proud. You felt like this time was different. Then something happened. A hard day, a harsh comment from someone you trusted, a wave of tiredness that hit harder than usual. And just like that, the plan fell apart, and you went right back to the same old patterns, wondering what was wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You have just been missing one piece nobody ever fully explained. Every habit you have ever built or broken was never really about discipline alone. It was about emotion, the feelings you never learned to notice, the triggers running quietly under your daily choices, the old wounds still shaping decisions you make without even realizing it. This is the missing link between wanting to change and actually changing for good. In the pages ahead, you will learn why willpower keeps failing you, how to spot the hidden emotional patterns sabotaging your progress, and how to turn even your hardest feelings into the exact fuel that keeps you moving forward. You will learn how to stop fighting yourself and finally start working with yourself. This is not another list of rules to follow. This is the real reason your habits have never stuck, and exactly what to do about it, starting today. Chapter 1. Discover why willpower alone always fails without emotional awareness first. You wake up on a Monday morning with a plan. Today is the day. You are going to eat clean, hit the gym, avoid your phone until noon, and finally start writing that book you have been talking about for 3 years. You feel the fire in your chest. You feel unstoppable. By 10 a.m., you have already checked your phone 11 times, eaten a donut someone left in the break room, and told yourself you will start tomorrow instead. Sound familiar? This is not a story about laziness. This is not a story about weak character. This is the story of almost every human being who has ever tried to change their life using willpower alone, and it always ends the same way, because willpower was never designed to carry the weight you are putting on it. For decades, self-help culture has sold us a myth. The myth says that successful people simply want it more. The myth says that if you just grit your teeth, clench your fists, and push through the discomfort, you will build the habits that transform your life. Push harder, try harder, want it more. This message is everywhere, printed on posters in gyms, shouted in motivational videos, whispered in every "just do it" campaign you have ever seen. And it is incomplete. It is not wrong exactly, but it leaves out the one piece of the puzzle that actually determines whether your effort survives contact with real life. That missing piece is emotional intelligence. Willpower is a muscle, and like any muscle, it fatigues. Researchers who study self-control have found that our capacity to resist temptation and push through discomfort is a limited resource that depletes throughout the day. Every decision you make, every temptation you resist, every frustration you swallow, chips away at that reserve. By the time evening comes, most people are running on fumes, which is exactly why so many diets collapse at 9 p.m. in front of the refrigerator, and why so many good intentions dissolve the moment the day gets hard. If your entire strategy for change relies on this depleting resource, you are building your future on sand. The tide will come in, and the sand will wash away. But here is what almost nobody tells you. The reason willpower runs out so fast is not because you are broken. It is because you are trying to fight a war on the wrong battlefield. You are trying to outmuscle your habits using logic and grit, while the real command center of your behavior is sitting quietly behind the scenes, pulling strings you cannot see. That command center is your emotional state. Every habit you have, good or bad, is anchored to a feeling. You do not reach for your phone because you logically decided it was the best use of your time. You reach for it because you felt a flicker of boredom, or anxiety, or loneliness, and your brain learned long ago that scrolling soothes that flicker, at least for a moment. You do not skip the gym because you forgot how important exercise is. You skip it because you felt tired, or overwhelmed, or unworthy of the effort. And no amount of knowing the health statistics changes that feeling in the moment it strikes. This is the secret that separates people who transform their lives from people who stay stuck in the same cycle year after year. It is not that the successful ones have more willpower, it is that they have learned to read their own emotional weather before it turns into a storm. They have learned to notice the quiet whisper of resistance before it becomes a shout. They have built a relationship with their inner world instead of ignoring it and hoping brute force will be enough. Think about the last time you broke a promise to yourself. Really think about it. Not the excuse you told other people, but the actual moment right before you gave in. There was a feeling there. Maybe it was frustration after a hard conversation. Maybe it was exhaustion after a long day of holding everything together. Maybe it was a quiet sadness you did not even have words for. Whatever it was, that feeling showed up first, and your behavior followed right behind it like a shadow. Willpower tried to stand between you and that feeling, and willpower lost, because willpower was never built to process emotion. It was only built to override behavior temporarily, and temporary is not the same as lasting change. Emotional intelligence works differently. It does not try to override the feeling, it tries to understand it. When you develop emotional intelligence, you stop asking, "How do I force myself to do this?" and start asking, "What am I actually feeling right now, and what is that feeling trying to tell me?" This single shift in questioning changes everything, because feelings are not random, they are information. Anxiety is often information about a threat your mind perceives, even if that threat is imagined. Boredom is often information about a need for stimulation or meaning that is not being met. Exhaustion is often information about a boundary you have not been honoring. When you understand what your emotions are trying to communicate, you stop needing to fight them with force, because you can address the actual root instead of just battling the symptom. Consider a man trying to quit smoking using pure willpower. Every time the craving hits, he grits his teeth and tells himself no. This works for a while, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. But cravings are not really about nicotine alone. They are often tied to stress, to social situations, to boredom, to a need for a break in his day. If he never learns to recognize what emotional state triggers the craving, he is fighting an invisible enemy with his eyes closed. Eventually, on a day when stress is high and his willpower reserve is already drained from 100 other small battles, the craving wins, not because he is weak, but because he never addressed the emotional root that was driving the behavior in the first place. Now imagine the same man learning to pause before lighting a cigarette and asking himself honestly what he is feeling. He notices it is almost always stress after conflict with his manager. Once he sees this pattern clearly, he can build a different response to that specific emotional trigger, something that actually soothes the stress instead of masking it. This is not about having more discipline. This is about having more awareness, and awareness is what emotional intelligence provides that willpower never can. This pattern repeats across every habit you have ever tried to build or break. The person who cannot stick to a budget is usually not bad at math. They are often soothing anxiety or reward-seeking through spending, and no spreadsheet will fix an emotional wound. The person who cannot stop procrastinating is usually not lazy. They are often avoiding a feeling of fear or inadequacy that shows up the moment they sit down to start the important task, and no productivity app will fix a fear they have never named. The person who cannot maintain a calm temper with their children is usually not a bad parent. They are often carrying stress and exhaustion that has nowhere else to go, and no parenting book alone will fix an emotional reservoir that is already overflowing. In every single case, the surface behavior is a symptom, and emotional intelligence is the diagnostic tool that lets you see the real condition underneath. Here is where this becomes deeply practical, because understanding this truth is only useful if you know what to do with it. The first step toward building real emotional intelligence is learning to pause, not for an hour, not for a day, for 10 seconds. When you feel the pull toward an old habit, whether that is reaching for your phone, skipping a workout, snapping at someone you love, or reaching for food you do not actually want, train yourself to stop for 10 seconds and ask one simple question: what am I feeling right now? Not what should I be doing, not what is wrong with me. Just what am I feeling? This single pause interrupts the automatic loop that has been running your behavior on autopilot for years. It creates a small gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap, you regain your power to choose. The second step is naming the feeling with precision. Vague feelings control you. Precise feelings inform you. If you only know that you feel bad, you have almost no power to respond wisely. But if you can identify that you feel overwhelmed because 3 deadlines are colliding this week, you suddenly have something concrete you can act on. Emotional intelligence is not about becoming a calm robot who never feels anything difficult. It is about becoming someone who can look their own emotions directly in the eye and describe them accurately instead of drowning in them or running from them. The third step is asking what the feeling actually needs, rather than what it is demanding in the moment. A craving for junk food when you are stressed is demanding sugar, but what it actually needs might be 5 minutes of quiet, a short walk, or a conversation with someone who makes you feel understood. The urge to scroll your phone when you are lonely is demanding distraction, but what it actually needs might be a real phone call to a friend you have been neglecting. When you start responding to the actual need instead of the surface demand, your habits begin shifting in a way that feels almost effortless, because you are no longer fighting yourself. You are finally cooperating with yourself. This is the heart of what separates lasting transformation from another failed New Year's resolution. Willpower asks you to become someone who can suppress their humanity through force. Emotional intelligence asks you to become someone who understands their humanity so deeply that force is rarely even necessary. One approach treats you like a machine that needs better programming. The other treats you like what you actually are, a feeling creature whose behavior makes complete sense once you understand the emotions driving it. There is a certain kind of strength in this approach that goes far beyond gritting your teeth. It is the strength of the person who does not need to white-knuckle their way through life, because they have built genuine self-understanding as their foundation. This is closer to the wisdom the old Stoic philosophers taught, long before modern psychology gave it new names. They understood that we suffer not from the events themselves, but from our reactions to those events, and that mastering the inner world is the truest form of discipline a person can develop. Marcus Aurelius did not become one of history's most respected leaders by white-knuckling his way through every difficult emotion. He became who he was by studying his own mind relentlessly, by understanding his triggers, his fears, his tendencies, and choosing his responses deliberately instead of being dragged around by every passing feeling. You have that same capability inside you right now. You do not need more discipline poured on top of a foundation you do not understand. You need to finally turn around and look at that foundation honestly. Every failed habit in your past was not proof that you are incapable of change. It was proof that you were trying to build change on top of emotions you never learned to read. That ends today. From this point forward, every time you feel the pull toward an old pattern, you have a new tool available to you. Pause. Name the feeling. Ask what it truly needs. This is not a soft approach. This is not an excuse to avoid discipline. This is the deepest form of discipline there is, because it requires you to stop hiding from yourself and start facing your inner world with total honesty. The habits you want are not out of reach because you lack willpower. They are out of reach because you have been trying to force your way past emotions you never took the time to understand. Understand them now. Sit with them. Question them. Respect them as messengers instead of enemies. When you do this consistently, something remarkable happens. The habits that once felt impossible to maintain start to feel natural, almost inevitable, because you are no longer working against your own nature. You are finally working with it. This is where real transformation begins, not in another burst of forced motivation, but in the quiet, honest moment when you finally ask yourself what you are truly feeling, and you have the courage to listen to the answer. Chapter 2. Recognize the hidden emotional triggers sabotaging your daily habits silently. There is a woman who has tried to stop yelling at her kids for years. She reads the parenting books. She nods along with every gentle tip about counting to 10 and speaking softly. She means every word of her promise each morning as she pours her coffee and tells herself, "Today will be different." And then, without warning, by 6 p.m. she is raising her voice over something as small as a spilled glass of juice. She walks away afterward feeling ashamed, wondering what is wrong with her, wondering why she cannot control something as simple as her own tone of voice. But nothing is wrong with her. She is standing on top of a trigger she has never been taught to see, and until she sees it, no amount of parenting advice will save her from repeating the same moment tomorrow. This is the trouble with emotional triggers. They rarely announce themselves. They do not walk into the room and introduce themselves politely before taking over your behavior. They work in silence, underneath the surface of your day, shaping your reactions before your conscious mind even has a chance to weigh in. A trigger is not the event itself. It is the meaning your nervous system attaches to that event, based on everything you have lived through before this moment. The spilled juice is not really about the juice. It is about a mother who has been holding her breath since 6 a.m., managing a job, a household, unspoken worries about money, and a body that has not had a real rest in weeks. The juice is simply the final straw, landing on a pile that was already too high to see clearly. Most people never identify their real triggers because they are looking in the wrong place. They believe the trigger is the last thing that happened, the visible event right before the reaction. But the visible event is almost never the true trigger. It is the spark that lands on a pile of dry wood that has been building for hours, sometimes for years. If you want to understand why your habits keep collapsing at the exact same moments, you have to stop studying the spark and start studying the pile. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the habit you have tried hardest to change and failed at repeatedly. Maybe it is snapping at your partner. Maybe it is reaching for a drink at the end of a hard day. Maybe it is opening your laptop at midnight to check emails you promised yourself you would not check. Now ask yourself honestly, does this always happen after the same kind of day? Does it happen more on days filled with conflict, or silence, or exhaustion, or comparison to other people's lives online? Patterns are always there if you are willing to look for them without judgment. The problem is that most of us look for them with so much shame attached that we flinch away before we can see anything useful. Hidden triggers usually fall into a small handful of categories, and once you learn to recognize these categories, you gain the ability to spot them coming from a distance, instead of being ambushed by them every time. The first category is depletion. This is what happens when your physical or emotional reserves run low, whether from lack of sleep, skipped meals, or hours spent holding your composure in situations that demanded more patience than you had to give. Depletion does not announce itself as depletion. It disguises itself as irritability, as sudden cravings, as a short fuse over things that would not normally bother you. The second category is unmet expectation. This trigger fires when reality does not match what you silently expected it to look like. Whether that expectation was about how your day would go, how someone would treat you, or how far along you thought you would be in your own goals by now. The gap between expectation and reality creates a quiet frustration that often gets misdirected at whoever or whatever happens to be nearby when it finally erupts. The third category is old wounds resurfacing. Certain tones of voice, certain kinds of criticism, certain feelings of being ignored or dismissed can reach all the way back into childhood and pull up a reaction that is far larger than the present moment deserves, because your body is not just responding to today, it is responding to every similar moment stacked behind it. Learning to notice these categories in real time is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with deliberate practice. One of the most powerful tools for this is what can be called the body scan check-in. Several times throughout your day, pause and notice where you feel tension in your body. Is your jaw clenched? Are your shoulders climbing toward your ears? Is your stomach tight? Your body almost always knows before your mind catches up that something has shifted internally. These physical signals are early warning lights on a dashboard you have probably never learned to read. Once you start noticing them consistently, you gain precious seconds of warning before a trigger fully takes over your behavior, and those seconds are exactly where your power to choose a different response lives. Another practical tool is keeping a simple trigger log for 2 weeks. Every time you slip into a habit you are trying to change, write down 3 things immediately afterward. What time of day it was, what happened in the hour before it, not just the moment right before. What you were feeling physically, whether tired, hungry, tense or rushed. Do not analyze it yet, just collect the data honestly, the way a scientist collects data without judging the results. After 2 weeks, sit down and read through everything you wrote. Patterns that were invisible to you in the moment will often become undeniable on the page. You might discover that your habit of overeating almost never happens because of hunger, but almost always happens on days you had a difficult phone call with a family member. You might discover that your habit of losing your temper with coworkers happens almost exclusively on days you skipped lunch. This is not a coincidence. This is your nervous system finally showing you its actual operating instructions instead of the story you assumed was true. Once a trigger is identified, the real work begins, because awareness alone changes very little if it is not followed by a different response. This is where many people get stuck. They learn to see their trigger clearly, feel a rush of insight, and then wonder why the behavior has not changed yet. Seeing the trigger is only step 1. Step 2 is building a different bridge between the trigger and your response, because right now, that bridge has been worn smooth by years of repetition, and a new path takes deliberate effort to carve. Start by creating what can be called an interrupt point, a small physical action you take the instant you notice a known trigger firing. This could be as simple as placing your hand flat on a table and taking one slow breath before speaking. It could be stepping outside for 30 seconds before responding to a frustrating message. It could be silently naming the trigger out loud, saying to yourself, "This is the depletion trigger," or "This is the old wound trigger." The specific action matters less than the fact that it exists at all, because any interrupt point creates a pause where none existed before, and that pause is where your old automatic pattern loses its grip. Real change also requires addressing the underlying category, not just managing the moment. If depletion is your primary trigger, the deepest solution is not more willpower in the heated moment. It is protecting your reserves earlier in the day through better sleep, regular meals, and honest breaks before you reach empty. If unmet expectations are your trigger, the solution involves examining which expectations are realistic and communicating them clearly, instead of silently hoping other people or circumstances will magically align with a picture only you can see. If old wounds are firing, the solution often involves working through that original pain directly, sometimes with the help of a therapist or trusted mentor, because a wound that has never been tended will keep reopening no matter how many new habits you try to build on top of it. There is something quietly liberating about this entire process. For years you may have believed your inconsistency was a character flaw, proof that you simply were not disciplined enough or committed enough to change. But inconsistency driven by unseen triggers is not a character flaw at all. It is a signal, pointing directly at exactly what needs your attention. Every time you fall into an old pattern, you are being handed information, not evidence of failure. The people who eventually build the life they want are not the people who never get triggered. They are the people who stopped being surprised by their triggers and started studying them instead, with curiosity rather than shame, until those triggers no longer controlled them in the dark. Your triggers have been running the show quietly for a long time, and today you get to turn the lights on. Watch your patterns without flinching away. Track them without judgment. Meet them with curiosity instead of self-criticism, because self-criticism only feeds the very cycle you are trying to break. The moment you can name what pulls you off course, you take back the steering wheel you thought you had lost. This is not a small shift. This is the beginning of finally understanding yourself well enough to change for good. Chapter 3. Master your emotions before you try mastering your habits fully. Chapter 4. Build unshakable self-awareness to understand your true behavioral patterns. A young athlete once trained for years to perfect his form. He studied footwork, memorized strategy, drilled technique, until his body could execute it without thought. And yet, every time he stepped into real competition, something betrayed him. Not his skill, not his training, his temper. One bad call from a referee, one mistake on the field, and his focus shattered into pieces he could not gather back up in time to recover. His coaches kept telling him to work harder on his technique, but technique was never the problem. He had built an impressive skill on top of an unstable foundation, and no amount of physical practice could fix what was actually an emotional gap. This is the story of almost everyone who tries to build habits without first learning to govern what is happening inside them. There is a common mistake in how people approach self-improvement. They treat habits as the main event, and emotions as background noise, something to deal with later if there is time. But this order is backward, and it explains why so many well-designed habit systems collapse under real pressure. You can build the most detailed morning routine, the most carefully structured workout plan, the most disciplined budget, and none of it will hold if your emotional world remains ungoverned, because your emotions are not sitting quietly in the background. They are sitting in the driver's seat, and your habits are simply passengers going wherever that driver decides to go. To master your emotions before mastering your habits does not mean suppressing what you feel or pretending to be calm when you are not. It means something far more demanding and far more rewarding. It means developing the capacity to feel something fully without being ruled by it. This distinction changes everything. A person who has mastered their emotions still feels anger, still feels fear, still feels the pull of temptation. The difference is that these feelings no longer make decisions on their behalf. There is a gap between the feeling and the action, and inside that gap lives real freedom. Picture two people receiving the exact same piece of harsh criticism from a boss. The first person feels the sting immediately, and within seconds, that sting turns into a spiral. They start thinking about quitting, about how unfair the workplace is, about every past failure that seems to confirm this new criticism must be true. By the end of the day, they have eaten poorly, skipped their workout, and snapped at their family, all triggered by 5 minutes of feedback they never processed. The second person feels the exact same sting. The criticism still hurts, because they are human, not a machine built from stone. But instead of letting the sting hijack their entire day, they pause, breathe, and allow the emotion to move through them like a wave, instead of a flood that drowns everything in its path. They might even feel the urge to spiral the same way the first person did, but they recognize the urge for what it is, an old pattern trying to take control, and they choose not to hand over the wheel. Same event, same initial feeling, completely different outcome, because one person had built emotional mastery and the other had not. This is why trying to fix your habits before addressing your emotional foundation is like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. It might stand for a little while when the weather is calm, but the first real storm will reveal exactly how unstable the structure always was. Emotional mastery is the bedrock. Once that bedrock is solid, habits become dramatically easier to build and sustain, because they are no longer at the mercy of every emotional wave that rolls through your day. So what does building this bedrock actually look like in practice? It starts with something deceptively simple, and that is learning to sit with discomfort without immediately needing to fix, escape, or numb it. Most people have never actually practiced this skill. From childhood, many of us were taught, directly or indirectly, that difficult emotions are problems to be solved quickly, distractions to avoid, or weaknesses to hide. So the moment discomfort arrives, whether it is boredom, sadness, anxiety, or frustration, the instinct is to reach for something that makes it disappear as fast as possible, whether that is food, a screen, a substance, or simply pushing the feeling down and pretending it is not there. Every time you do this, you reinforce a pattern that says, difficult emotions are unbearable and must be escaped immediately. And that pattern is precisely what destroys habits under pressure, because building any meaningful habit requires tolerating discomfort for a sustained period of time. Practice sitting with discomfort in small, deliberate doses. The next time you feel bored, resist the automatic reach for your phone for just 2 minutes. Notice what boredom actually feels like in your body without trying to escape it. The next time you feel a flash of irritation at a small inconvenience, resist the urge to react immediately. Let 5 seconds pass, notice the irritation rise, and notice, often to your surprise, that it also begins to fall on its own if you simply let it exist without feeding it. This practice, repeated consistently, trains your nervous system to understand that emotions are not emergencies. They are weather patterns, temporary and survivable, not permanent states that must be avoided at all costs. The second pillar of emotional mastery is learning to separate the emotion from the identity. When people feel angry, they often say, "I am angry," as though anger has become who they are in that moment. But there is a profound difference between being angry and experiencing anger. The moment you shift your internal language from "I am anxious" to "I am experiencing a wave of anxiety right now," you create distance between yourself and the feeling. This is not a trick of semantics. It genuinely changes how your brain processes the experience, because it reminds you that you are the observer of the emotion, not the emotion itself. The observer always has more choice available to them than the person who has become fully fused with what they feel. The third pillar is understanding that emotional mastery is not about eliminating negative emotions, but about widening your capacity to hold them without losing your center. Imagine your emotional capacity as a container. A person with a small container feels a modest amount of stress and immediately overflows into panic, poor decisions, and abandoned commitments. A person with a large container can hold significant stress, disappointment, or fear, and still function with clarity, because their container has more room before it overflows. You grow this container the same way you grow a muscle, through repeated, deliberate exposure to manageable amounts of difficulty, not through avoidance. Every time you choose to stay calm through a minor frustration instead of exploding, you are stretching your container just slightly larger. Do this consistently over months and years, and you become a fundamentally different person, someone who can absorb the pressures of real life without shattering. Consider what this means for the habits you have been struggling to build. The reason your exercise routine collapses when work gets stressful is not a lack of commitment to fitness. It is that stress overflows your container and exercise gets sacrificed as the emotional pressure valve releases somewhere else. The reason your budget falls apart during emotionally hard weeks is not poor math skills. It is that spending becomes a release valve for feelings you have not learned to hold. Once your container grows large enough to hold stress without needing an immediate release, your habits stop being casualties of your emotional weather. This work is not glamorous. There will be no dramatic before and after photo for emotional mastery. Nobody applauds you for sitting quietly with discomfort instead of reaching for your phone, or for pausing 5 seconds before reacting to your child's mess instead of yelling. But this invisible work is exactly what separates people who build habits that last decades from people who restart the same goals every January, year after year, wondering why nothing ever sticks. Master what happens inside you first. Learn to hold your emotions without being swept away by them. Once that foundation is solid, you will find that the habits you have been chasing for years suddenly become far more willing to stay. Chapter 5. Transform negative emotions into powerful fuel for lasting habit change. A man once lost his job after 15 years at the same company, escorted out with a cardboard box and a handshake that felt more like an apology than a goodbye. He went home that night and sat in his car in the driveway for nearly an hour, unable to walk inside and tell his family what had happened. The shame was heavy, the fear was heavier, but somewhere in that hour, sitting alone with everything he was feeling, something shifted. He stopped asking why this happened to him and started asking what this feeling was going to build in him. 2 years later, he had started a business built on skills that company never valued, driven by an anger and hurt he refused to let go to waste. He did not get there by pretending to feel fine. He got there by taking something painful and deciding it would become material instead of misery. This is the piece almost nobody teaches about emotional intelligence. Most people believe the goal is to feel good all the time, to chase positivity and avoid anything uncomfortable. But negative emotions are not the enemy of a good life. They are some of the most honest, most energizing forces available to a human being, if you know how to work with them instead of running from them. Anger carries enormous energy inside it. Shame carries a sharp, motivating clarity about the gap between who you are and who you want to be. Even grief, in its own strange way, carries a depth of feeling that can anchor a person to what truly matters to them once the sharpest edge has softened. The question was never whether these emotions are useful. The question is whether you have learned how to direct them, the same way a river can either flood a village or turn a turbine and light up an entire town, depending entirely on whether someone built the right channel for it to flow through. Most people do the opposite of this. They feel a negative emotion and immediately try to make it disappear as fast as possible. Frustration gets buried under distraction. Shame gets buried under denial. Anger gets buried under a forced smile, because expressing it feels dangerous or impolite. But burying an emotion does not make its energy vanish. It only makes that energy leak out sideways, usually into the very habits you are trying to build. The frustration you refuse to feel at work becomes the extra glass of wine at night. The shame you refuse to examine becomes the procrastination that keeps you from ever finishing the project that might expose you to judgment. Buried emotion always finds an exit. The only choice you have is whether you consciously direct that exit toward growth or let it leak out unconsciously toward self-sabotage. Turning a negative emotion into fuel begins with a shift most people find uncomfortable at first, and that is refusing to treat the emotion as a problem to be solved and instead treating it as information to be used. When frustration rises in your chest, instead of asking, "How do I make this go away?" ask, "What is this frustration pointing toward?" Frustration almost always points at a gap between your standards and your current reality. That gap is not a flaw in you, it is a map. It tells you exactly where your energy wants to go next, if you are willing to follow it instead of suppressing it. Consider a woman who feels a hot flash of jealousy every time a colleague gets recognized for work she feels she does better. Jealousy carries a heavy reputation, treated as something shameful to admit, let alone use. But underneath jealousy is almost always a signal about a desire you have not given yourself full permission to pursue. If she spends her energy hiding that jealousy or feeling guilty about it, it will quietly poison her relationships and her motivation both. But if she is honest enough to ask herself what that jealousy is actually revealing about her own unmet ambition, she gains access to a compass pointing directly at what she wants next. The emotion does not need to be eliminated, it needs to be interviewed. This interview process is a practical skill, not an abstract idea. The next time a negative emotion rises strongly enough to notice, before doing anything else, ask yourself 3 direct questions. First, what exactly am I feeling, named as precisely as possible, not just bad, but the specific flavor of bad, whether that is embarrassment, resentment, disappointment, or fear. Second, what is this feeling trying to protect or point toward, since almost every negative emotion exists because some value or need of yours feels threatened or unmet. Third, what is one small action I could take right now that honors what this emotion is pointing toward, rather than an action that simply numbs the feeling as fast as possible? This 3-step interview takes less than a minute, but it transforms a wave that could have wrecked your day into a wave that can carry you somewhere useful. There is also a longer-term version of this same principle, and it involves looking at the emotional wounds you carry from your past, not to dwell in them, but to extract their fuel deliberately. Nearly every person who has built something remarkable in their life can point to a specific painful moment that became the origin point of their drive. The athlete cut from a team who trained relentlessly to prove the coach wrong, the student told they would never amount to anything who built a career specifically to make that prediction laughable. The person who grew up without financial stability, who built discipline around money, precisely because they remember what its absence felt like. None of these people are pretending the original pain did not hurt. They simply refuse to let that pain be the end of the story, choosing instead to let it become the beginning of a different one. If you want to try this for yourself, take a few minutes to write down a moment from your past that still carries a charge when you think about it, whether that is embarrassment, rejection, failure, or loss. Do not write to relive the pain. Write to ask a single question: what did this moment teach me about what I refuse to accept for the rest of my life? That answer, once you find it, is often the clearest fuel source you will ever discover, because it is anchored to something real, something lived, something that already changed you once, and can be directed to change you again on purpose this time. There is an important distinction here that must not be missed. Using negative emotion as fuel is not the same as staying angry, staying bitter, or staying stuck, replaying old wounds on repeat. Fuel is meant to be burned, converted into motion, not hoarded and stared at forever. If you find yourself telling the same story of hurt for years without any resulting action or growth, the emotion has stopped being fuel and started being an identity, and that shift will trap you rather than propel you. The goal is always conversion. Feel it fully, extract its lesson honestly, and then let the action you take be the place where that energy finally gets to land. This approach changes your entire relationship with hard days. A setback at work is no longer just a setback, it is raw material. A painful conversation with someone you love is no longer just painful, it is information about what needs repairing and what you truly value in that relationship. The discomfort of falling short of a goal is no longer just discomfort, it is the exact friction needed to sharpen your next attempt. You stop needing life to be easy in order to keep moving forward, because you have learned how to turn even its hardest moments into the very thing that pushes you higher. This is not positive thinking dressed up in new language. This is something sturdier and more honest, a willingness to look directly at what hurts and ask what it can build, instead of only asking how fast it can be made to disappear. Chapter 6. Strengthen your emotional resilience to survive setbacks and stay consistent. A woman training for her first marathon twisted her ankle 6 weeks before race day. She had followed her training plan with near-perfect discipline for months, and in one careless step on an uneven sidewalk, all of it seemed to collapse. Her first thought was not about the injury itself. It was a single sentence looping through her mind, telling her this proved she was never cut out for this in the first place. That sentence felt more true in that moment than anything her months of training had shown her. She sat on the curb, ankle swelling, and had to make a decision that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with her mind. She could let this setback confirm the story that she always fails, or she could treat it as one data point in a much longer journey. She chose the second path, modified her training, healed properly, and crossed the finish line 8 weeks later than planned, but crossed it all the same. The ankle was never the real obstacle. The story she almost told herself about the ankle was. This is the essence of emotional resilience, and it is often misunderstood. Resilience does not mean feeling unaffected by setbacks. It does not mean bouncing back instantly with a smile as though nothing happened. Real resilience is far more human than that. It means allowing a setback to hurt, to disappoint, to knock the wind out of you for a moment, while refusing to let that setback rewrite the larger story of who you are and what you are capable of building. The difference between people who stay consistent for years and people who quit after the first real obstacle is rarely talent or circumstance. It is almost always this one skill, the ability to separate a single failure from a permanent identity. Every person pursuing meaningful change will eventually hit a wall. This is not a possibility to prepare for someday. It is a guarantee, as certain as weather changing throughout a year. The plan will get interrupted by illness. The diet will get broken by a stressful week. The business will lose a client it could not afford to lose. The relationship will go through a season of distance. None of this makes you unusual or uniquely unlucky. It makes you a person living an actual life, where friction is simply the terrain, not a sign that you took a wrong turn. The people who eventually reach their goals are not the ones who avoided this terrain. They are the ones who learned how to keep walking across it without losing themselves along the way. The first skill inside emotional resilience is learning to separate the event from the meaning you assign to it. This distinction changes everything about how a setback affects you. The event is neutral information, something that happened in time and space. The meaning is the story your mind attaches to that event, often within seconds, often without your conscious permission. Missing a week of workouts is an event. I always quit on myself is a meaning, and it is a meaning you were never required to accept. The moment you catch yourself assigning a sweeping, permanent meaning to a temporary event, you have found the exact place where resilience either gets built or gets abandoned. Practice pausing right there and asking yourself honestly, is this meaning actually true, or is this simply the loudest voice available in a painful moment? Painful moments rarely produce accurate conclusions. They produce loud ones, and loud is not the same as true. The second skill is what can be called the return practice, and it is deceptively simple. Resilience is not built by never falling off track. It is built entirely in how quickly and how gently you return once you have. Most people treat a broken streak as proof the entire effort was wasted, and this belief alone destroys more consistency than any single missed day ever could. One missed workout does not erase 3 months of training. One difficult conversation handled poorly does not erase years of growth in how you communicate. The damage rarely comes from the slip itself. It comes from the extended exile people put themselves through afterward, the week or month of giving up entirely because a single day did not go as planned. The return practice asks a different question. Instead of asking, how did I fail, it asks, what is the smallest possible action I can take right now to return to the path? Not a dramatic comeback, not a perfect restart, just the next single step, taken as soon as possible after the fall, because the length of your exile matters far more than the fact that you fell in the first place. The third skill is building what could be called an evidence file, a collection of proof drawn directly from your own life that you are someone who returns, someone who does not quit permanently, even when you quit temporarily. Most people carry a mental highlight reel of their failures, replayed in vivid detail, while their comebacks fade quietly into the background unnoticed. This creates a distorted self-image, one built almost entirely from worst moments rather than the full picture. Counter this deliberately. Keep a written or mental list of every time you have returned to something after falling away from it, no matter how small. The time you started reading again after a 2-year gap. The time you rebuilt a friendship after months of silence. The time you got back to exercise after an injury sidelined you for a season. Each entry in this evidence file becomes a rebuttal to the voice that shows up during your next setback, claiming you always give up. You will have proof, real and specific, that this voice has been wrong before. Resilience also depends heavily on how you treat yourself in the immediate aftermath of a setback. And this is where self-compassion becomes a practical tool rather than a soft, optional nicety. Harsh self-criticism after a failure feels productive in the moment, as though beating yourself up will somehow prevent future mistakes. Research on this consistently shows the opposite. People who respond to their own setbacks with understanding rather than cruelty are more likely to try again quickly, while people who respond with harsh judgment are more likely to give up entirely, because shame makes people want to hide, not improve. The next time you fall short, try speaking to yourself the way you would speak to a friend going through the exact same struggle. Notice how different that tone feels compared to the voice you usually default to, and notice how much easier it becomes to take the next step forward when you are not also nursing a wound you inflicted on yourself. Consistency, over the long stretch of years that actual transformation requires, was never going to come from a perfect, unbroken line of good decisions. Nobody has ever lived that line. Consistency comes instead from a jagged path full of interruptions. met again and again with a willingness to return without drama, without extended punishment, without rewriting your entire identity around a single bad week. The setback will come, this is certain. What is not yet decided is what you will tell yourself about it, and how quickly you will find your way back to the path once it passes. Build that return muscle now, in the small setbacks of today, so that when the larger ones arrive, as they eventually will for everyone, you already know exactly how to stand back up. Chapter 7. Replace self-criticism with self-compassion to sustain long-term personal growth. Chapter 8. Develop emotional discipline to make consistency your natural daily default. A man who ran his own small business used to start every difficult morning the same way, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, listing everything wrong with himself before he had even eaten breakfast. Not disciplined enough, not smart enough, behind where he should be at his age. He believed, without ever questioning it, that this harsh inner voice was the thing keeping him sharp, the thing preventing him from becoming lazy or complacent. For years he treated cruelty toward himself as a kind of fuel. It was only after a health scare forced him to slow down that he noticed something strange. The harsher he was with himself, the less he actually accomplished. The days he woke up and tore himself apart mentally were, without exception, his least productive days. The inner attack that was supposed to be motivating him was quietly draining the exact energy he needed to do good work. This is one of the most common misunderstandings about personal growth, and it deserves to be examined honestly. Many people believe self-criticism is what pushes them toward excellence, that if they ever stop being hard on themselves, they will collapse into laziness or mediocrity. This belief runs so deep that self-compassion often gets mistaken for self-indulgence, as though being kind to yourself is the same as making excuses for yourself. But these are not the same thing at all, and confusing them is one of the most damaging mistakes a person can make on the road to lasting change. Self-criticism operates through fear. It works by making you feel unworthy, inadequate, or in danger of failure if you do not perform. This can produce short bursts of effort, the same way a person might sprint briefly if a threat is chasing them. But fear-based motivation was never designed to sustain a marathon. It burns hot and fast, and it leaves behind exhaustion, anxiety, and a growing resentment toward the very goals you are supposedly pursuing. Over months and years, harsh self-talk does not build discipline. It builds a nervous system that associates growth itself with danger, and eventually that nervous system starts avoiding growth altogether, simply to escape the internal punishment that comes with trying and falling short. Self-compassion operates through an entirely different mechanism, and this is where the confusion usually clears up once people actually understand what it means. Self-compassion is not the absence of high standards. It is not telling yourself that mistakes do not matter or that effort is optional. Self-compassion means holding yourself to real standards while responding to your own struggles, the same way a good mentor would respond to someone they genuinely wanted to see succeed, with honesty about what went wrong, paired with encouragement about what comes next. A good coach does not scream insults at an athlete who missed a shot. A good coach names the mistake clearly and then immediately points toward the correction and the next opportunity. This is not softness, this is effectiveness, because people learn faster and try again sooner when they are not also managing the emotional wreckage of being torn down by their own mind. There are 3 components that make up genuine self-compassion, and understanding each one turns this idea from an abstract feeling into something you can actually practice. The first component is self-kindness instead of self-judgment, which means noticing your instinct to attack yourself after a mistake and deliberately choosing a gentler, more accurate tone instead. The second component is recognizing common humanity instead of isolation, which means remembering that struggle, failure, and imperfection are part of what it means to be human, not proof that you alone are uniquely flawed or behind everyone else. The third component is mindfulness instead of over-identification, which means acknowledging painful feelings honestly without exaggerating them into a permanent verdict on your entire worth as a person. Together, these three components create a response to failure that is honest, grounded, and far more sustainable than the harsh alternative most people default to without ever questioning it. Practicing this begins with catching the moment self-criticism starts speaking, because it often moves so fast and feels so familiar that it goes completely unnoticed, like background noise you stopped hearing years ago. The next time you make a mistake, whether it is missing a deadline, losing your temper, or breaking a promise to yourself, pay close attention to the very first sentence your mind produces. For most people, this sentence is brutal, often something they would never say out loud to a friend in the same situation. Notice this sentence without immediately believing it. Simply notice it, the way you might notice weather passing outside a window, present but not necessarily true. Once you notice the harsh sentence, practice replacing it with a specific alternative, built around three honest questions. First, what actually happened, described factually without dramatic language. Second, what would I say to a close friend if they came to me with this exact same situation? Third, what is one useful next step, rather than a punishment, that would actually help right now? This three-question process takes less than a minute, but repeated consistently over weeks and months, it fundamentally rewires the automatic response your mind reaches for after a setback. You are not lowering your standards by doing this. You are simply making sure your standards are paired with a voice that can actually help you meet them, instead of a voice that makes meeting them feel impossible. Consider how this plays out with something as ordinary as breaking a diet plan for one meal. The self-critical voice says something like, "You have no discipline, you always ruin everything, you might as well give up for the rest of the week since you have already failed." Notice how this voice does not just address the single meal, it expands instantly into a verdict about your entire character and your entire future, and this expansion is exactly what makes self-criticism so destructive. It never stays contained to the actual event. The self-compassionate voice, by contrast, says something closer to, "One meal does not undo months of consistent effort. This is a normal part of building a new habit. The next meal is a fresh opportunity to continue." Notice how this voice stays anchored to the actual facts, instead of spiraling into a permanent identity crisis over a single moment. One of these voices keeps you moving forward. The other one convinces you that moving forward is pointless. There is a deeper reason this matters beyond simply feeling better in the moment. The relationship you have with yourself after failure directly determines whether you keep trying or whether you quietly give up over time. If every mistake is met with internal punishment severe enough to feel unbearable, your mind will begin avoiding any situation where mistakes are possible, which in practice means avoiding growth itself, since growth by definition requires attempting things you have not yet mastered. But if mistakes are met with honest acknowledgement and genuine encouragement, your mind stays willing to keep attempting difficult things, because the cost of failing has been made survivable instead of devastating. This is the quiet mechanism behind why self-compassionate people so often outlast self-critical people in the pursuit of long-term goals. It was never about who cared more. It was about who built an internal environment where trying again remained possible. Self-compassion is not a reward you earn after you finally become good enough. It is the very foundation that makes becoming good enough possible in the first place. The version of you that is still learning, still stumbling, still figuring out how to build the life you want, deserves the same patience and encouragement you would offer freely to anyone else walking that same difficult road. Extend that patience inward starting today. Notice the harsh voice, question its accuracy, and replace it with something honest and useful instead. This single shift will not make growth painless, but it will make growth sustainable. And sustainable is the only kind of growth that ever actually lasts. Chapter 9. Align your habits with your deeper values and emotional purpose. A woman spent an entire year forcing herself to wake up at 5 in the morning because a podcast she admired told her that successful people all share this one habit. She hated every single one of those mornings. She dragged herself out of bed in the dark, sat groggy and resentful through a routine she had copied from someone else's life, and by mid-morning she was already running on empty, irritated with her family, unable to concentrate at work. She kept waiting for the moment this habit would finally start feeling natural, the way everyone promised it would. That moment never came, because the habit was never actually hers. It belonged to someone else's values, someone else's version of a meaningful life, borrowed and forced onto a life it was never built to fit. The morning she finally gave herself permission to sleep until 6:30 and use that recovered time connecting with her children before school, something shifted immediately. The new routine required just as much discipline, but it no longer felt like punishment, because for the first time it was actually built around what she cared about, instead of what she thought she was supposed to care about. This story repeats itself in countless variations across countless lives, and it points to one of the most overlooked reasons habits fail, even when a person has plenty of willpower and even plenty of emotional intelligence already in place. A habit disconnected from a person's actual values will always feel like a weight to drag, no matter how well designed the habit itself might be. You can build the perfect system, track every metric, optimize every variable, and still find yourself unable to sustain it, because the deepest engine behind any lasting behavior is not structure, it is meaning. When a habit is aligned with something you genuinely value, effort stops feeling like a battle against your own nature and starts feeling like an expression of who you actually are. Most people never take the time to clarify their actual values before building their habits, and this is where the disconnect begins. They borrow goals from culture, from social media, from well-meaning parents, from a version of success that was designed for someone else's life entirely. Wake up at 5, read 50 books a year, build a business, run a marathon. None of these goals are wrong in themselves, but none of them are automatically right for you either, and adopting them without examining whether they connect to something you genuinely care about is exactly why so many habits crumble the moment life applies real pressure. A habit built on borrowed values has no roots. The first hard week will pull it straight out of the ground. Discovering your actual values requires a kind of honesty many people avoid, because it means separating what you have been told to want from what you genuinely want underneath all that noise. One useful practice for this is looking backward instead of forward. Think of 3 moments in your life when you felt most fully alive, most yourself, most proud of how you were showing up in the world. These moments do not need to be dramatic achievements. They might be as quiet as a conversation where you truly helped someone through a hard time, or as simple as finishing a project you built with your own hands. Look closely at what those moments have in common. Was it connection with other people? Was it mastery over a skill? Was it contributing to something larger than yourself? Was it freedom and independence? The threads that run through your proudest moments are almost always pointing directly at your real values. Values that were there long before any habit tracker or productivity book tried to hand you a pre-written list. Once you have a clearer sense of what you actually value, the next step is examining your current habits honestly and asking which ones are genuinely serving those values and which ones were adopted simply because they looked impressive or because someone else insisted they mattered. This audit can be uncomfortable because it often reveals that a significant portion of your daily effort is being poured into things that do not actually connect to what you care about. Maybe you have been forcing yourself into a rigid diet built around someone else's aesthetic standards, when what you actually value is having sustained energy to be present with your family. Maybe you have been grinding at a side hustle that looked admirable on social media, when what you actually value is deep rest and unhurried time with the people you love. There is no shame in discovering this gap. Nearly everyone carries some version of it, inherited from years of absorbing other people's definitions of a life well lived, without ever pausing to write their own. Realigning a habit with your values does not always mean abandoning the habit entirely. Often it means reconnecting the habit to its true purpose, the reason underneath the reason. Consider exercise. A person who exercises purely because they feel they should, because a number on a scale demands it, or because they fear judgment for not doing it, is running on a fragile source of motivation that will collapse the moment life gets difficult. But a person who reconnects exercise to a genuine value, whether that is wanting the energy to play actively with their grandchildren decades from now, or wanting the mental clarity that movement gives them to handle stress with more patience, is running on something far sturdier. The workout itself might look identical from the outside. The internal experience of doing it is completely different, because one version is compliance and the other version is purpose. A practical way to build this alignment is to write a single sentence connecting each major habit you are trying to build to the deeper value it serves, and to make that sentence specific rather than vague. Not simply, "I want to be healthy," which is too abstract to generate real emotional pull, but something closer to, "I exercise because I want to still be strong enough to travel and explore the world with my partner when we are 70. Not simply, "I want to save money," but something closer to, "I save money because I value the freedom to leave a job that no longer respects me without panic about how I will survive." Specificity creates emotional weight, and emotional weight is what carries a habit through the days when motivation alone has completely disappeared. This alignment also changes how setbacks are experienced. When a habit is connected to genuine purpose, missing a day feels different than when a habit is simply an arbitrary rule you imposed on yourself. Missing a workout when your only reason was an external number feels like failure and often triggers the kind of shame spiral that leads to quitting entirely. Missing a workout when your reason is rooted in wanting decades of strength and connection with people you love feels more like a pause than a collapse, because the purpose behind the habit has not gone anywhere just because one day did not go as planned. Purpose provides a kind of elasticity that rigid rules never can, allowing you to bend without breaking when life inevitably interrupts your plans. There is also a quiet emotional cost to living out of alignment with your values that many people carry without ever naming it clearly. It shows up as a persistent, low-grade dissatisfaction, even when things on paper appear to be going well. Careers that look successful from the outside, but feel hollow from the inside. Relationships maintained out of obligation rather than genuine connection. Daily routines completed diligently but experienced as a slow drain rather than a source of energy. This dissatisfaction is not a mystery to be endured. It is information, quietly pointing toward the gap between the life you are actually living and the life your deepest values are asking you to build. Closing that gap, one honestly examined habit at a time, is some of the most important work available to any person serious about lasting change. Building a life around your true values instead of borrowed ones is not a single conversation you have with yourself once and then finish. It is an ongoing practice of checking in, adjusting, and staying honest as your understanding of yourself deepens over time. The habits that last are never the ones enforced through fear or copied from someone else's highlight reel. They are the ones woven so tightly into what you actually care about that maintaining them stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like simply being who you already are. Chapter 10. Commit fully to lifelong growth by mastering emotional intelligence daily. An old carpenter once trained an apprentice who kept asking when he would finally be finished learning the craft. The apprentice imagined a day when the tools would feel fully mastered, when every joint would come together perfectly on the first try, when there would be nothing left to improve. The carpenter, well into his 60s by then, laughed gently at the question. He explained that he still discovered something new about wood, about patience, about his own hands, on almost every project he touched. He was not a beginner anymore, not by any measure, but he had also never arrived at some final destination called mastery. What he had instead was something better, a relationship with his craft that kept deepening the longer he stayed in it. This is exactly the relationship you are being invited to build with your own emotional life, not a finish line to cross, but a practice to return to for as long as you are alive. Everything covered up to this point, learning why willpower alone was never enough, recognizing the triggers running quietly beneath your habits, mastering the emotions beneath your behavior, transforming pain into fuel, building resilience through setbacks, replacing self-attack with self-compassion, aligning your daily actions with what you actually value. All of it has been building toward a single truth that deserves to be said plainly now. Emotional intelligence is not a technique you apply during a difficult season and then set aside once life feels calm again. It is not a course you complete or a book you finish and check off a list. It is a daily practice, as ongoing and as necessary as breathing, because your emotional world does not pause simply because you have learned a few tools to manage it. There will be a temptation, somewhere down the road, to believe you have arrived. You will have a good stretch of weeks or months where your habits hold steady, your reactions stay measured, and your relationship with yourself feels solid. This is a wonderful place to be, and it deserves to be enjoyed fully. But it is not permanent, and believing it is permanent is exactly what leaves people unprepared when life inevitably applies new pressure they have not faced before. A new kind of loss, a new kind of failure, a new kind of relationship strain that tests parts of you the previous season never touched. Emotional intelligence is not a wall you build once and then stand behind forever. It is closer to physical fitness, something maintained through ongoing practice, something that will atrophy quietly if neglected, no matter how strong it once was. This is not meant to discourage you. It is meant to free you from an exhausting and inaccurate expectation, the belief that struggling again someday means you failed to learn the lessons in this book. You did not fail. You are human, living inside a life that keeps changing, and a human life will always keep presenting new emotional terrain to navigate. The goal was never to become a person who no longer struggles. The goal was to become a person equipped to meet struggle with skill instead of being blindsided by it every single time. So what does committing to this as a daily practice actually look like, once the initial motivation of reading a book like this one has faded into the ordinary texture of everyday life? It starts small, smaller than most people expect, because grand daily rituals rarely survive contact with a busy, imperfect life. Begin each morning, even if just for 60 seconds, by checking in honestly with what you are feeling before the demands of the day arrive, and drown that awareness out, not analyzing it deeply, simply naming it. This single minute, repeated daily, keeps the muscle of self-awareness active instead of letting it go dormant the way it will if only exercised during moments of crisis. Build a brief evening reflection into your day as well, even if it only takes a few minutes before sleep. Ask yourself what triggered you today and whether you responded to that trigger in a way that moved you toward the person you want to become or away from them. This is not an invitation to self-criticism, a trap already addressed and already understood as counterproductive. It is simply an honest accounting, the same kind an athlete keeps of their training, tracking patterns over time so that growth remains visible, even on days when it does not feel obvious in the moment. Return regularly to the values you clarified, because values are not static either. They shift as your life shifts, as your relationships deepen, as your priorities evolve through different seasons. What mattered most to you 5 years ago may not be what matters most today, and what matters most today may shift again 5 years from now. Revisit this periodically, perhaps every few months, and ask honestly whether your current habits are still serving the values you actually hold, or whether some quiet drift has occurred that deserves your attention and correction. Expect setbacks to keep appearing, not as evidence that something has gone wrong, but as the ordinary texture of a life still being lived fully. The return practice you built earlier remains just as necessary years from now as it was on the first difficult week. The self-compassion you practiced will be needed again, probably many times, because being human never stops requiring it. None of these tools were ever meant to be used once and retired. They are meant to become part of the permanent architecture of how you move through your days, quietly present in the background the way breathing is present, rarely noticed but always essential. There is a particular kind of strength that develops in a person who commits to this work over years rather than weeks. It shows in how they handle a crisis that would have derailed them completely a decade earlier. It shows in the quality of their relationships, built on a foundation of genuine self-awareness rather than reactive patterns passed down unexamined from childhood. It shows in their ability to keep showing up for their goals across an entire lifetime, not because they never struggle, but because struggle no longer has the power to permanently knock them off their path. This strength is not loud. It rarely announces itself, but it is unmistakable to anyone who spends real time around a person who has done this work consistently, because there is a steadiness to them that circumstances alone cannot explain. You were never meant to finish this journey and set it aside. You were meant to begin a relationship with your own emotional life that continues for as long as you are breathing, deepening with every season, every hardship, every quiet, ordinary Tuesday, where nothing dramatic happens but you show up honestly with yourself anyway. This is the real secret behind every lasting habit you have ever admired in someone else. Not perfect discipline, not a single breakthrough moment that fixed everything at once. A daily, humble willingness to keep learning who they are and keep choosing, again and again, to meet themselves with honesty instead of avoidance. That same willingness is available to you starting today, and it will still be available to you tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as you choose to keep showing up. This is not the end of your growth. This is simply the moment you finally understood that growth was never supposed to end at all.